If you're trying to become a developer, chances are you're making this one mistake, and it's likely what's holding you back from landing a job. Now, that mistake is jumping from topic to topic and field to field without really understanding what it is that you need to focus on. Now, that's exactly why I'm making this video. Once you've learned the fundamentals of programming, you need to work on specializing so you're actually qualified for the jobs that are out there. Now, the most popular specializations to choose from are front-end, back-end, or DevOps. Sure, there are hundreds of different areas that you could get into, but most of them are going to be rooted from one of these three specializations. So now let me break down the difference between each of these three fields so you understand which one to go with and how to actually start making some serious progress. So let's start with a quick overview. Front-end is all about building user interfaces, working with designers, and bringing a user experience to life. You're going to be doing a lot of styling, layouts, and overall you'll be responsible for the look and feel of an application or product. Now, backend is all about data and security. You'll be responsible for writing code that's mostly hidden from the user, but that's critical to the infrastructure of an organization or a product. Now, with backend, you're going to be working with databases, authentication, performance, and designing and implementing scalable systems. And then we have DevOps, which is about unifying development and operations. DevOps is all about making the lifecycle faster by building automations, doing continuous deployment and testing, monitoring and logging, and really responsible for all of the operations you need to perform to actually bring a product into the hands of users. Now, regardless of which of these paths you choose, you'll eventually do some DevOps work. You'll probably have some kind of application that you actually want to push out to production. Now, when you do that, that's going to involve configuring, monitoring, and building an entire pipeline that allows you to do continuous integration and continuous deployment. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, this is a huge pain. Now, fortunately for us, the sponsor of this video, JetBrains, has a solution with TeamCity Pipelines. This offers a new intelligent approach to CI and CD by providing self-tuning pipelines that won't ever break your dev flow. Best of all, it's free during the public beta to try it out. Now, whether you prefer using YAML for configuring your pipelines or you want to set them up visually via the brand new visual pipeline editor, TeamCity Pipelines will get you to a functioning pipeline in just minutes. This will save you time on endless Googling and documentation reading. Not to mention that TeamCity Pipelines can cut your runtime by up to 40% thanks to the smart pipeline optimization. It can even suggest optimal configurations and provide automatic test parallelization. Get started with TeamCity Pipelines today for free by clicking the link in the description and signing up with your GitHub account. Now let's get right into what you guys care about. Which of these fields is the easiest to get into and which of them pay the best? Now I'll start with difficulty and kind of the ease of entrance into these three different fields. Now the truth is that your personality type and what you're interested in is really going to dictate which of these is easier for you to master, but regardless, I'm going to give you the kind of common opinion on which of these is easier. So we can start with front-end development, which is typically considered the easiest field to break into. Now, the reason for that is the tech stack you need to learn is the simplest to pick up. It's also very visual. That means as a beginner, you can immediately see exactly what it is that you're building, and people who are just getting into programming find that this is a bit more intuitive and it's easier for them to pick up and learn these different languages. Now, with that in mind, front-end development is extremely in demand. Companies always need front-end developers, but that also means that there's a lot of competition. This is usually what most people will start learning if they want to break into the tech industry really quickly, so you're going to be competing with a lot of other junior engineers for those entry-level positions. That said, it's still a great one to go with, and it probably is one of the fastest ways to get a tech job. Now, backend, on the other hand, is slightly more difficult to break into, and that's because you need to have a strong understanding of server-side programming languages, database systems, performance, and building scalable systems. These topics are typically harder to master, or at least people find them more difficult, and I will say that there are slightly less roles for backend developers. With that said, there is still a ton of demand, and because this is more difficult, you'll often find that there is less competition because there's less qualified people for the role. Now with backend, there's so many different stacks that you could learn, so many different languages you can pick up, and that allows you to really specialize yourself for certain types of roles, and you can stand out compared to a more generic front-end role where everyone's going to know JavaScript, everyone's going to know HTML, so compared to front-end, slightly less roles, but it could be easier, if not the same, to land a position in backend development. Now, lastly, we have DevOps. Now, this is definitely the most difficult to break into, and that's because you need to have a strong understanding of both development and operations. So building automations, continuous integration, continuous deployment, monitoring, but also cloud services and security. Now, DevOps roles do typically require some level of experience, and that's because you're working in critical production-grade environments, and if you do make a mistake, that's going to have a huge consequence on the business or the application you're supporting. With that said, though, there is typically much higher demand for DevOps role than there is supply, and that's because less people go into this field, and it's much harder to master. So if you are someone who's willing to commit the time and really understand these DevOps principles, you can definitely be outcompeting a lot of people for jobs, and you can find yourself in a position where you really have the leverage and people want to hire you because there's just less qualified people in that field. That's what I've found, and that's what I've heard talking to other DevOps engineers. Typically, they can demand a higher salary, but it is a harder or higher barrier to entry and does maybe require that they first had a role in some kind of back-end or front-end job before. So now let's dive into the pay. Now, truthfully, the pay here is not a huge difference, and I wouldn't pick one of these roles simply because you see a higher average salary. Whatever you think you can get into and master the quickest, or that's going to be of interest to you, is what I would highly recommend going with. Regardless, though, let me share with you the figures for the pay for front-end, back-end, and DevOps engineers. So front-end engineers are typically paid the least, and the average salary in the United States for a front-end engineer, this includes seniors, juniors, just everything, the complete average is $107,000. Now for back-end engineers, this is $116,000, and for DevOps, this is estimated at $138,000. So you can see the DevOps is significantly higher, but again, a lot of those roles are not junior or entry level, meaning you would need some experience or you'd at least need to learn a ton to be able to land those positions. Now, with all of that in mind, as you climb the experience ladder as a front-end, back-end, or DevOps engineer, you can get paid a ton of money. If you're a really good front-end engineer, you could easily be making hundreds of thousands of dollars. Same with back-end, same with DevOps. So don't pick one of these positions simply because of the pay you just saw there. Remember that if you get really good in one of these fields, you're going to earn a lot more than you would if you were just a decent back-end developer or a decent developer in another field that didn't interest you as much. Whatever you think you can get good at, what is really your interest and what you're going to like to learn a lot about is where you're going to make the most amount of money. So keep those figures in mind, but don't pick one purely because of the salary. They're all high salaries, and the truth is, again, if you master one of these fields, you're going to get paid a lot. So now what I'm going to do is break down the responsibilities and kind of tech stack and languages that you need to know for each of these roles so you can understand the full picture of what you'll actually be doing, and you have some better information to make your decision. So let's start with front-end. As a front-end developer, your responsibilities are the following. Don't mind if I look at my screen, I just have some of them written down, so I'm going to read them out. We have developing user interfaces, optimizing user experience, working with designers and also sometimes back-end engineers, ensuring front-end performance, and testing and debugging. Now, this is probably the simplest job description, but generally speaking, what you're doing is being responsible for how the product looks and feels. A lot of people overlook this, but a lot of what you're doing is fine-tuning user experience. How does the website feel to use? How does the app feel? How does the game feel? Everything that a user touches, that's what you're responsible for, and there's a lot more to that than simply design. Even simple things like how far do I need to move the mouse to get to a button? Does the button have a hover effect? Does it feel tactile? These are things you're going to be considering a lot as a front-end engineer, and you're also going to be dealing with responsive design. How do we make sure that this app works on all different kinds of systems? How do we make it accessible so that people that have maybe hearing issues or visual issues are able to utilize our application? There's a lot of things you need to do as a front-end developer, but a lot of it is simply building that user interface. It's very visual and it's really easy to see what you need to do and when something looks good or when it looks bad. Regardless, some of the languages and technologies you'll need to know as a front-end developer include the following: HTML, CSS, JavaScript, most likely TypeScript as well, and then you're going to have to know about different frameworks. So depending on the company you work for, maybe that's React, maybe that's Vue, maybe that's Angular. There's a bunch of different front-end frameworks, and these are constantly changing, and as a front-end developer, you need to keep up with all of those trends. Even things like server-side rendering, bundling front-end code, when you start to get to more mid and senior level positions, there's a lot more that you need to think about, but it all kind of stems and starts from those languages that I just shared. So now let's move on to the back-end developer. Now, as a backend developer, here are some of your core responsibilities. You're going to be doing server-side development, building out APIs. You're going to be working with databases and database management. You also need to do application integration, so how does the backend work for various different types of front ends? Then you'll be working with security, you'll likely work with performance, and then you're going to be doing some testing, of course, and deployment and maintenance. Now you'll notice here that sometimes your DevOps and your backend roles will share responsibilities, and that's because a lot of companies don't have dedicated DevOps teams, and they just bring a lot of the DevOps responsibilities to the backend team. So even though you shouldn't necessarily have to do all of this as a backend developer, sometimes you will be doing a little bit of DevOps work, and if you're a DevOps engineer, sometimes you will be doing a bit of backend work. So keep that in mind. Some of the responsibilities are blended depending on the type of company, how large it is, and how many people they have working in the different roles. Now, in terms of frameworks and technologies you'll likely need to know, you're going to have to know some backend languages. Now, this really varies because there's so many different languages and tech stacks you could be using. You could be using something like Python, and then you'd be expected probably to know about Django, Flask, maybe Fast APIs, some of those different frameworks. You might be working with Rust, C++, PHP, Java, .NET, Go. There's so many different stacks, and that's actually what's kind of nice about backend. You can really optimize your profile and your skill set for specific jobs, and you could be, for example, an expert .NET developer or Java developer, not just a general backend developer. Whereas typically with front end, most of your front end engineers are going to know a lot of these different frameworks and they're going to have a similar skill set. Yes, obviously you can specialize, but with backend, there's a lot more options and there's a lot of different stacks that you'll want to learn. If you go look at job positions, you'll see that people will specifically look for backend Python developers or backend Ruby developers or backend PHP developers. So you do need to kind of narrow it down and pick a specific backend language or backend tech stack. Beyond that, you're going to need to know about SQL and NoSQL databases. How do they work? How do you write SQL code? What's the difference between them? Some jobs want you to know about specific databases like MySQL, PostgreSQL, MongoDB, etc. Other than that, things like web server technologies, so Nginx, Apache, then API development, developing REST APIs, GraphQL. Cloud services, so things like AWS, Azure, what are the other ones we have here? Google Cloud. Some companies want you to be familiar with one of those different ecosystems. And then finally, we might have containerization and virtualization. This is something that usually will happen more on the DevOps side, but as a backend developer, you might need to know this as well. Understanding Docker, Kubernetes, deployments. Again, sometimes those responsibilities and roles kind of blend together. So lastly, let's talk about DevOps. Now, as a DevOps engineer, you'll be responsible for continuous integration and continuous deployment. So testing the code, making sure that it's working, that it's functioning, and then continually deploying that to the users or to the production environment. Next, infrastructure as code, monitoring and logging, performance tuning, doing security and compliance. So if you work for a really, really big company, there's a lot of compliance that you need to consider. That's something to keep in mind. Cloud server management. So again, working with these platforms like AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, whatever it is that the company's using. And then disaster recovery and backup. There's a lot of other things that could come in here, but those are the main topics and things that you'll likely be responsible for. Now, in terms of technologies, you will want to know some basic programming. You will want to be familiar with development, but you're also going to want to know some of the following. So maybe Jenkins, GitLab, Travis CI, GitHub Actions, all these things for doing continuous integration and continuous deployment. You're going to want to know about Terraform, Kubernetes, CloudFormations, Docker. You're also going to want to do monitoring and logging. So maybe you're familiar with tools like Prometheus. Then you're also going to have to know about cloud service providers as well. Again, Google Cloud, AWS, Azure, etc. Scripting, this is a big one. You're probably going to want to know a bit of Python, a bit of Bash, maybe something like Ruby, depending on the scripting language that you'll need to use. And then networking and security, you probably want to have the fundamentals of that and understand how that works. And then lastly, of course, you want to know about databases as well, like SQL and NoSQL databases. So now, before we go any further, let me quickly cover a question many of you have probably had, which is, Tim, what about all the other fields of development? Well, yes, you could go specialize in game development, you can get really good at robotics or all these other fields that exist like augmented reality, virtual reality, etc. But there is less positions in those fields, and truthfully, if you can get good in one of these different areas, it's a lot easier to transition into something else. If your goal is to land a job as a developer, I do recommend sticking to one of these three fields, at least in your early career, and then you can more easily transition into all of these other fields where you do usually require a bit more experience. experience. If you're going to be a virtual reality developer, for example, typically you're going to need development experience. In order to get that development experience, it's easier in one of these 3 fields. Some of you may disagree with me on that, but that's typically my advice, and that's why I'm just mentioning these 3. Now, with that in mind, we also have full stack development. Well, before you can become a good full stack developer, you would need to either be a front-end developer or a back-end developer. Sure, you can learn them at the same time, but if you want to be really, really good, you would first specialize in one, and then you would add all of those additional skills. At least that's how I would recommend that you do it. Anyways, with all of that said, let's quickly talk about how you actually pick which one you want to specialize in. The truth here is that all that really matters is what interests you the most. Now, if when I was talking about these, one of these really resonated with you and you feel pretty confident that that's what you want to do, then go for it. Pick that as your specialization. But if you're not sure which one you want to get into and this video gave you the information, but you're still kind of in between which one you would like, I'd recommend trying each of them. I don't mean spending 3 months on all of them, I mean spending 2 or 3 days and building out a front-end project, then building out a back-end project, then doing something with DevOps. Watch a few tutorials, go online, read more about all of the different fields, and really try to understand which one is going to interest you the most and what you're going to be able to commit to for the long run. The biggest mistake and what holds people back is that they get good in one field and then they decide that they really don't like it because it was the wrong one to start with, and they go and they relearn, for example, backend or DevOps and start all the way from the beginning. That's really going to hinder your career and keep making you take steps back. So if you can make the correct decision now, you can go all the way up the ladder, and rather than switching between all these different fields, you can really become a master of your craft. Now, last thing to note here is that if you are interested in any of these 3 fields, I do have a software development course where you can actually pick a specialization in front-end, back-end, or DevOps after trying and working with all of the different topics. You can check that out from the link in the description. Anyways, I'm going to wrap it up. Like the video, leave a comment, and I will see you in the next one.